Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about why it's important to balance both training frequency and training volume for the Natty lifter. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skill at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And this is one of those topics that gets really complicated because of the rampant use of anabolics in the lifting world and fitness world, because you see so many guys who train primarily upon or focus upon training volume, because we know that weekly volume, weekly tonnage, and people need to understand volume isn't just sets and reps. Volume is also weight on the bar, how far you move the bar. Obviously, someone who's doing work sets with 500 pounds on an exercise versus someone who's doing work sets with 250 pounds is doing twice the volume. So keep that in mind when we start discussing volume and recovery and everything. You do need to keep that in mind. There is a weight component, there's a tonnage component, there's a work done component, not just 3 sets of 10, 5 sets of 8. There's a lot more to your volume than that. And again, that varies from person to person because of individual leverages, how long their limbs are. So even then, tonnage isn't equal person to person. Now, what people always like to say things like, well, everything works a little bit different for everyone. Everyone's different. That's a cop-out. There is truth to that, but that is a cop-out to not try to find basic rules. What we generally know is that when someone is completely drug-free due to the fact that their muscle protein synthesis after training a muscle returns to normal within 1 to 2 days, up to 48 hours, training frequency becomes very, very important for drug-free lifters. Okay? The more frequently you train a muscle, the more muscle mass you tend to gain in that muscle when weekly volume is equal. Okay? When weekly volume is equal. But generally speaking, more weekly volume up to a certain threshold will still produce more overall muscle gains. So we really run into that fine balance of how many days in the gym a drug-free lifter wants to be in there. And that's why I usually tell people, if you're going to be completely natty, you're not going to be a full-time athlete, meaning you have other stressors in your life. You either go to school, you have a full-time job, a career, maybe a family. You probably don't want to be training more than 3 to 4 days a week. Yes, I understand that there are studies showing that, at least for intermediate and advanced lifters, doing the same exercise 5 or 6 days a week does produce more muscle mass. But it's very small amounts, and then you have the problem of the training frequency interfering with your life. That's why I tell guys, either you usually want to do a full body 3 days a week. For most people, and again, there will be exceptions to people who don't have a lot of stressors, maybe people who are a student, they don't have a difficult major, they're trying to compete in powerlifting. All right, they might want to consider increasing the frequency, messing with Bulgarian style training. But otherwise, you want to be able to hit each muscle at least 3 to 4 times a week. And you can do that to some extent with either a full body 3 times a week or like a push-pull or upper-lower type training 4 days a week. And the reason I say that is because a lot of your exercises are going to hit both. In other words, if you're deadlifting on a lower body day, you are working your upper body. If you're push pressing on an upper body day, you're working the lower body. There's going to be a lot of overlap there. This sort of stuff goes out the window for people who are doing too much isolation in machines, which again, problematic for the natural lifter. Natural lifters really got to balance how much total fatigue they're going to subject their body to. So training frequency absolutely matters. You really need to be hitting a muscle, ideally not much more than about 48 hours between workouts if you're drug-free, if you're really trying to gain quality muscle mass. And I'm not saying you can't gain muscle on a body part split. As long as volume is sufficient, you can, but it will not be the same sort of growth potential you can get messing with higher frequency training, which again is going to require you to be more careful with your exercise selection, which gets to the other point, total volume. Drug-free lifters do not have the recovery to handle the same sort of total volume that enhanced lifters do, which is one of the reasons I always say you can't do I'm going to do 15 sets per body part, I'm going to do 5 different exercises, because again, you handle something like 15 sets for a muscle group. If you're trying to train with any sort of frequency, that's going to become a problem. Unless you're doing it with all compounds. Yeah, I mean, if you're counting your rows and chin-ups and you're doing 5 sets of each of those every week, okay, you might have room for 5 sets of curls left, because those are also working other muscles. That's getting all your back work and everything done. But when people are trying to do large numbers of different exercises per body part, you end up running into volume problems, you end up running into time constraints in the gym. Right, drug-free lifters don't need to be lifting weights for 2 to 3 hours every day. Probably not ideal unless you're taking very long breaks so that you can do heavy weight. Again, if you're doing 10 sets of 3 to 5 reps and you're taking 3 or 4 minutes between sets, okay, that makes more sense to do something like that. But if you're coming in training with any sort of slightly higher reps for more metabolic fatigue, you're taking relatively short breaks, 2 or 3 minutes, there's no reason for someone to be in the gym 2 or 3 hours who's drug-free. You're going to hit recovery inroads and you're going to end up having to space out your training further, which kind of defeats the purpose. Because, there's that thing, you need a certain amount of workload to generate maximum muscle mass, but for a drug-free lifter, you need a certain amount of frequency. And balancing those two can be difficult. That means that you're going to have to be selective in what you do in each workout. You're going to have to be efficient because you really don't want to be lifting more than about an hour and a half each session. Well, if you're training half or more of your body every time you train, which is what you're going to have to do if you're drug-free and trying to get enough frequency and balance all your recovery, you're going to have to be selective with your exercises so that you can get enough workload, enough tonnage for every muscle, enough fatigue to stimulate good muscle growth, but not so much that your whole body is overly fatigued or that individual muscles are too taxed to recover enough to come train them again 2 or 3 days later. Because again, we run into the issue of more drug use style training tends to be a lot of volume, lots and lots of sets. But then people who aren't on these drugs will struggle to recover and train with enough frequency. And people say, well, how come that works for people on drugs? Well, number one, they recover slightly easier. They can handle the workloads a little better. Number two, they're not as reliant upon natural muscle growth. Their muscles can be growing 7 days a week, sometimes off of a single workout. Someone who's drug-free, that's just not going to happen. If you train, say, your back and your biceps really hard on Monday, they're going to be done growing by Wednesday. They're not going to grow anymore if you're not on anything. People are on 2 or 3 grams of gear. Their biceps and back might be growing 10 days still after that workout, 7 days, 8 days, 10 days, because of the increased muscle protein synthesis from it. And so that's why that sort of training has become very popular. But the problem we run into, again, for drug-free lifters, natty lifters, is balancing the amount of workload you need to stimulate growth versus what you can recover from enough to keep the frequency high enough. Now, here's where we get into the everyone's different thing. People will say, well, how much workload is too much? That's a highly individual question. The problem we run into there is that one really isn't a cop-out. Everyone's different on the amount of workload you can handle. You will have to either run a proven template that someone else has written that works for at least 50% of the population, which in case you got a good chance of it, any of my programs, any of Bill Starr's programs, any of Joe DeFranco's programs. There's a lot of strength and conditioning coaches out there with free programs. Use their templates to work off of. It will probably work for you. You might be an exception, but it'll probably work. But the thing we run into is that otherwise you're going to have to experiment and find where you recover how much workload you can personally handle on certain exercises before you can't train again effectively on those same lifts or same body parts in 2 or 3 days. You're going to have to find your own recovery, and you know what? It's going to change over time because people's training history matters. People's genetics matter. Some people handle higher volumes of really heavy weight better than others. Some people handle high volumes of metabolic fatigue or really high reps better than others. They recover faster than other people. Also, your past training experience matters. Someone who has trained a certain way years ago, there can be permanent changes to the way they've adapted. In other words, if someone did a bunch of strength training in high school for football, and they come back and they train again, they pick up training again, their recovery curve, there can be permanent changes to your body. There's evidence of that scientifically. There can be long-term changes that you readapt to. Your previous training experience affects that. As far as your work capacities, how you recover, structural changes in the muscle tissue, clearance rates. People who have been endurance athletes are going to have a slightly different type of recovery. Your training history and how you trained in the year before your current program will affect the amount of workloads that you can handle and recover from. The stronger you get, the easier it's going to be for you to push beyond your recovery abilities also. And it goes back to the other point. Someone who reps 500 pounds on an exercise versus someone who reps 250 pounds on the exercise can be the same person. Because that person who's lifting 500 pounds on the deadlift used to lift 250 on the deadlift back in the past. He is now capable of generating far more tonnage per set per minute per hour of training because he's dramatically stronger. Therefore, he can beat his recovery up more quickly and more easily than someone who's less experienced. And that's something that you have to factor in as you train. You're going to find that sometimes over time, when you're pushing the same sort of rate of perceived exertion, you can't handle the increased volume of the new weights and the strength that you could when you were weaker, because you're creating far more tonnage. Your organs and everything else in your body haven't necessarily adapted. A lot of things in your body that impact recovery don't improve their work capacity dramatically over time. Certain aspects of your muscles do, maybe your bones do to some extent, but it isn't a linear curve. You're going to find that as you get stronger, yeah, your work capacity will increase, but also oftentimes your ability to overtax your own recovery ability will become increased also, and you will find it easier to overtrain. Again, simply put, it's far easier to overtrain doing sets of 5 reps with 500 pounds versus 250 on the same exercise. Think of it in those terms. It's still the same structure, it's still the same organs in your body, it's still the same bones you had when you were lifting half the weight. Those things all have to recover. It's not just your muscle tissue, your nervous system, your bones, connective tissue, all of that stuff has to recover. So it is far more important for drug-free lifters to think these things through and really consider their training frequency versus their workload and understand how it affects them and develop ways to train for themselves that doesn't mirror the training methods of guys who are on 2 grams a year, which is probably half of your YouTube guys. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.